Hey, everybody. We are talking about the Columbian Exchange and the Atlantic trade system in this unit's podcast. Right off the bat, you're going to see a map for the Treaty of Tordesillas from 1494. Thank you, Pope Alexander VI. This was signed as a way to prevent Spain and Portugal from fighting over newly discovered territory, and you cannot see the air quotes that I'm doing right now, because they were bickering over who had rights to it. So this decree was put into place to grant these two empires the rights to these areas. And we're going to talk about what the implications of that were. So first and foremost, we have to talk about the Columbian Exchange and exactly what that was. Guys, this is the first time that the East and West hemispheres are actually going to be united. Prior to this, there had been absolutely no forms of trade, no forms of communication, and this is going to start a truly global trading network. But this came with a lot of consequences and events that would forever alter the world. So first, take a look at what this actually is. The Columbian Exchange is defined as the transfer of people, animals, plants, and disease between the New World and the Old World. And the New World is North and South America. It's not new. Europeans just didn't know about it. So they would call this the New World. And then over here we have the Old World. You'll also notice that a lot of the crops that are heading over to the Americas are not actually native to Europe. They're native to Africa. And a lot of them are also native to Asia. But coming over, we have some very important crops: potatoes, a big one, corn or maize. We would have tobacco, and that's going to become a huge cash crop. We would also have cacao, chocolate. Coming over, we'll see cattle, horses, which are going to be a massive game changer, rice, wheat, bananas, and citrus fruits. So within the Columbian Exchange, the people of the New World lacked immunity to diseases from people of the Old World. Again, you can't see me. I'm doing the air quotes right now. But Europeans brought over diseases that indigenous people of the Americas had never been exposed to. Smallpox was the #1 killer, followed by measles, diphtheria, typhus, influenza, malaria, yellow fever, and also something called pulmonary plague. And this caused catastrophic declines in the population of native peoples in the Spanish and Portuguese colonies. Similar patterns of contagion and mortality rates may be observed in the English and French colonies in North America. And Europeans did not use disease as a tool of empire and a tool of conquest, but the spread of these diseases undermined the ability of indigenous peoples to resist settlement and accelerated cultural change. And when we were looking at the Aztec and the Inca, both of these massive empires were conquered by Spanish conquistadors in a very short period of time. And the #1 killer of the Aztec and the Incas, it wasn't the guns that these conquistadors brought, it wasn't their steel weapons, it was the disease they carried. Smallpox and measles wiped out or weakened the majority of people in these empires, which then allowed the conquistadors to take over. European, Asian, and African food crops were also introduced to the Americas. And American crops, again, including maize, beans, potatoes, tobacco, these were brought to the Eastern Hemisphere. And the introduction of New World food crops is thought to be one of the main factors that contributed to the rapid growth in world population after 1700. However, the introduction of European livestock, such as cattle, pigs, horses, and sheep, had a dramatic influence on the environment and the cultures of native people of the Americas. These livestock destroyed the crops of some Amerindian farmers. And the introduction of cattle, sheep, and horses, while it did benefit some people, led to massive environmental changes. But no animal had a greater impact than the horse. It increased both the hunting efficiency and military capacity of indigenous North Americans in particular. So taking a look at colonial economies. The economies of Latin America were dominated by the silver mines of Peru and Mexico and the sugar plantations of Brazil. And this would lead to a dependence on mineral and agricultural exports. In particular was the silver mine of Potosi. And this would dominate the economy of Spanish colonies until about 1680. And then the silver mines of Mexico. Silver mining and processing required a very large labor force and led to environmental effects that included deforestation, as well as mercury poisoning, first on the indigenous people who were enslaved to mine the silver, and then by African slaves who were kidnapped and brought to the Americas. In the agricultural economy that dominated Spanish America up to the 1540s, Spanish settlers used the forced labor system of encomienda to exploit Amerindian labor. With the development of silver mining economies, new systems of labor exploited were devised. In Mexico, a free wage labor, and in Peru, the mita. We'll talk about what these are in a little bit. When we look at the mita, though, what's important to remember is that this is not the same system the Inca used. This particular mita system used in Peru called for 1/7 of adult males to be drafted into a forced labor system to work for essentially nothing. And originally it was for 2 to 4 months of the year, but these men could be taken for months, and many of them died because of the inhumane conditions they faced. The Portuguese developed the African slave labor system, particularly for harvesting sugar. And these sugar plantations in the Atlantic Islands were some of the worst places human beings could possibly be. The Brazilian planters first used indigenous slaves and then African slaves. Sugar and silver played important roles in integrating the American colonial economies into the system of world trade. Again, this is the first time there will be a truly global trade network because of sugar, because of coffee, and because of silver. So looking at the society in colonial Latin America, the elite of Spanish American colonies consisted of a relatively small number of Spanish immigrants and then a large number of their American-born descendants. The Spanish-born peninsulares dominated the highest level, followed by the Creoles, who were Europeans that were born in the Americas. There was a growing population of individuals who were of European and Amerindian descent, and they were known as mestizos. And then you also had people of mixed African and European or African and Amerindian descent. This system was known collectively as the castas, and it was a social class system specifically based on where you were born and what you looked like. Under colonial rule, the cultural diversity of Amerindian peoples and the class differentiation within the Amerindian ethnic groups were eroded. Some natives, especially elites, sought to protect their positions and status by intermarrying with colonists. Others, specifically commoners, suffered the heaviest burden of the colonial system. A lot of women were also forced into marriage, as most of the Spanish colonists who came over were single men. This is actually a pretty stark contrast to the North American colonies, where the majority of settlers coming to North America were families or people who were bringing their families over. At first, people who were brought from various parts of Africa retained their different cultural identities. But with time, various traditions blended and mixed with European and Amerindian languages and beliefs to form very distinctive local cultures. Slave resistance, including rebellions, was usually brought under control, but runaway slaves occasionally formed groups that defended themselves for years. These were called quilombos in Brazil and palenques in Spanish colonies. In colonial Brazil, Portuguese immigrants controlled politics and the economy. But by the early 17th century, Africans and their American-born descendants, who were both slaves and freemen, were the largest ethnic group in Brazil. The Spanish crown tried to exert direct control over its American colonies, but this was really difficult because the communication between Spain and the New World led to situations in which viceroys, or governors appointed by the Spanish crown, of New Spain and Peru had a lot of power. After some years of neglect and mismanagement, the Portuguese in 1720 appointed a viceroy to administer Brazil, to have a very similar political system happening. The governmental institutions established by Spain and Portugal were highly developed. They were costly bureaucracies that thwarted local economic initiatives and political experimentation. The Catholic Church played a very important role in transferring European language, culture, and Christian beliefs to the New World. Catholic clergy converted large numbers of Amerindians, although some of them secretly held on to their native beliefs and practices. Catholic clergy also acted to protect Amerindians from some of the exploitation and abuse of Spanish settlers. One example is a man named Bartolomé de las Casas. He was a former settler who actually became a priest, and he denounced the Spanish policies towards the Amerindians and worked to improve their status through legal reforms such as the New Laws of 1542. And part of the issue when we're looking at primary documents during this time period, especially the account of the Aztecs and what happened, is most of these surviving documents were written by the Spanish. There's not really any point of view of an Aztec survivor. So these sources are all biased. And that's really important to remember when we actually read them in class. Catholic missionaries were frustrated because Amerindian converts blended Christian beliefs with elements of their own religion and rituals. And this created unique forms of Christianity. But by 1600, this resistance, as well as the rapidly declining numbers of indigenous peoples in the countryside because of disease, led the church to redirect its energies towards the colonial cities and towns. And this is where the church could found universities and secondary schools, and they played significant roles in the intellectual and economic life of the colonies. There were a number of resistance movements that rose up. One of them was called Metacom's Rebellion. It was also known as the First Indian War, the Great War, or King Philip's War. It took place in southern New England between 1675 and 1676. And this was the last-ditch effort to avoid recognizing English authority and to stop English settlement upon native lands. And the war was the chief Metacom, who was later known by Philip or King Philip, led a 14-month bloody rebellion as revenge for an attack that had occurred during the Pequot War, which is where 500 Amerindian women, men, and children were slaughtered by an English captain named John Mason in a village in Connecticut. There was also the Pueblo Revolt, in which Native Americans living in what is now New Mexico rose up against Spanish conquistadors in the wake of religious persecution, violence, and drought. And the uprising aimed to reclaim Pueblo religious practices, culture, and land, which had been taken away by the Spanish conquistadors. Both of these uprisings ultimately failed. And although the Pueblo uprising did fail to take back Santa Fe from Spanish colonizers, the Pueblo people made a lasting impact on the dominant culture of the Southwest. The Spanish did regain Santa Fe from the Pueblos, but their missionary vision was somewhat compromised by the sentiment that was stirred up during this uprising, and the resistance to Catholicism and the Catholic Church would also continue to build. Finally, I do want to talk to you about the types of labor that occurred. So the Inca mita system was typically a way to pay taxes and for the communities to come together to build. But when this was adopted in Peru, it was changed that 1 out of every 7 men was forced to carry out labor in a way that didn't benefit any of the Inca or any of the people that were not Europeans. Chattel slavery, that is slavery. That's the Africans who were kidnapped and then brought to the Americas, as well as to different port cities in the Indian Ocean trade. We will talk about the African slave trade in our next podcast and the horrors that came with it. It is described as the greatest human atrocity in history. We're going to be talking about the millions of people who were taken. We'll look at indentured servitude, and this is typically where at first Europeans and then later on men and women from Japan and China signed on for a period of servitude, typically 5 to 7 years. They'd work to pay their passage, typically to the Americas, usually North America, and what their life was like. Typically, their life was not good. And then finally, the encomienda and the hacienda system. The encomienda, a system of labor where an individual who owned the land, therefore owned the people who lived on that land and could force them to do work. The hacienda system, people who own debt, their debts could actually be sold to somebody and they would be forced to work until that debt was paid off. We will continue on later with the African slave trade as part of the Atlantic trading system.